This pattern was actually coined by Dr. Waldo Tobler, which is, everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And if you just remember that, and begin the lessons within the cemetery, and what Walter Frantz had provided, it's really very important to identify where those near things are and what constraints exist around them to indicate potential relatedness. So let's go through my case study in the Emmons line. I'm a descendant of the emigrant William Emmons, who had Arthur, who had Orange. And if you remember, I have been looking for Orange. Could not find Orange in Lauren's records. I began to think that Orange might be with either Ira, Carolyn, or Charles. So I began that process, looking through the census records to see if maybe I could find Orange. Orange was not with Ira in the 1850 census. So then I began the process to say, well, maybe Orange lived with Carolyn. And what I had done was begin the process of saying, well, Carolyn, if she lived, was probably married. And for 3 years, I began to search through the records to find who had married Carolyn. And I, through arduous research, both on site and online, I was actually able to find Carolyn's spouse, that she had married a Miles Hillman Skiff. And that eureka moment was to say, I might now find Orange. So as I found that name, I immediately went to the census records and found Miles and Carolyn. 3 years after finding Ira. And where were they? Living right next door to Ira. Literally looking up the page. I think there's an important lesson here, maybe as I should have looked up or looked left and right, but because I was so focused at that time using surname-based techniques to be able to find people that I did not fully at that moment comprehend the power of location. As I began to understand that swirl around that area, then those patterns were even more reinforced. If I had researched the area first, what we began to see are clear patterns driven by physical geography. These observations of this area were actually made by a local pastor in 1900. We find this plateau set up on rough peaks containing many little sub-valleys with fertile slopes. Nature set it off by itself, for to reach it by anywhere but the sky, you must rise. Sounds like a difficult place to get into and to get out of. For the last 100 years, this region has been inhabited by 250 to 500 souls, rarely less than one or more than the other. Clearly an economy that had a limited capability, especially a agricultural economy, to absorb anything more than that pattern. But here's the key. And looking at this map, as you look at the orientation, the winter problem hinders communication by blocking all east and west roads and making the north and south ones difficult. The purple line, as you see cutting through the mountains, is actually cutting north. As the purple line breaks to the right, that is East Street. A very key indicator here that when it snowed, that on East Street, you weren't going anywhere. And more importantly, it may have been even difficult to get to church. So looking at these patterns and looking who lived there, I next looked at Charles Emmons to see, was Orange with Charles? Orange wasn't with Charles. What I did notice, though, is certain patterns, not only Charles and where he lived, but also the occasion of the Smiths who lived with him 10 years later as he moved from being a blacksmith and to being a conductor with the railroad. And it came to find out that he had married a Smith, and unfortunately, that this woman had died, but he maintained responsibility for his in-laws. An honorable man. What was fascinating in understanding the patterns of Ira and Carolyn and Charles, and looking again at this geography in this tiny little hamlet, this little village of Ellsworth, is understanding again those words of that minister. because it became very apparent between the interaction of the Skiffs and the Emmons and the Everetts and the Smiths and even the Parmaleys, as at looking at this census, all of them lived on East Street. That the physical geography of the area so strongly influenced the interaction of these families that basically by living on the same street as indicated by this census, that this was the strongest pattern of potential relatedness. And these families all married into each other. This power of geography is also reflected even in our DNA. A couple of recent news items. Number one, ignore the headline, two Germans sharing the world's longest family tree. The key thing is that there were Bronze Age cave dwellers who were found, and their DNA was captured and tested. And people in the village close to this cave where these graves were found were also tested. And two individuals that were within a mile of each other, or a half mile of each other, of this burial site, came to be not only related to each other, but also related to the people within that burial site. So distance is not only a key indicator of relatedness within time, but sometimes it can prove that based on strong ties to a region, that it can transcend, centuries, if not millennia. Recently in the UK, there was a 9,000-year-old burial. The DNA was extracted. They did testing in the local area, and within a half mile of this burial site was found to be someone who was related to this individual across 90 centuries, to have been related to the Stone Age individual. So the pattern of geography and distance can really transcend time. I am proud to be a descendant of Piagina in Italy, and before conducting research on site, I actually used Google Earth to understand this physical geography, having learned those lessons in the hills of Ellsworth. And this became very important for me to identify additional sources of likely relatedness, not only understanding this physical geography and this clearly indicating that there's going to be patterns of relationships within the town because of these strong barriers of these mountains. But also, if you look in nearby Valle dell'Angelo, that clearly there would be interactions between these two small hamlets as well, because the transportation network allowed it. And that clearly was a key indicator for me in conducting my research on site about where to find likely relationships. The other thing too, and this is where I had ancestors in nearby Sacco, is that this physical analysis not only provides you a sense of barriers to distance and understanding, the strong sense that physical geography can have in the interrelationships with families, but also gives you a sense of what the history is. When I look at a site like this and seeing that this small village was placed at the base of this mountain, one of two things comes to mind. One is that it might have been because of weather considerations, but it also might have been because of defensive considerations, where it'd be very difficult for someone to come over the mountain to attack you from the rear, and then you would have the ability to command the high ground. So it also bespeaks the potential or the history of violence in those areas. And you really, just by looking at the picture, you're able to see a great deal of potential insight as you begin to understand the lives that your ancestors and their ancestors might have had within that location. But hopefully what you've seen to this point, the first law of geography, that those who are near are more related than those who are further away, and the physical constraints of the physical geography itself can really reinforce the first law. I love this slide because it really indicates both two things here as I transition from physical geography to the human geography. On the right is a familiar map of Western Europe. You see NO for Norway, FI for Finland, DK for Denmark. ES1 is Spain, ES2 the Basque region, PT Portugal, FR France, and the rest. On the left are patterns of relationships. Look on the bottom on the left. You see IT1 and IT2. What separates these two parts of Italy from each other? It's the Alps. Look at Finland. The Finns aren't related to anyone here. And why? Because apparently where Sweden intersects Finland, that icy barrier was too much, and that the Finns became basically ethnically segregated from the rest of Europe, where the Swedes interfaced with both the Germans and the Danes, as you can see here on the map. You can see too Portugal merging into ES1, which is Spain, merging into ES2, which is the Basque region, merging into FR, France. That clearly people's relationships didn't depend on physical boundaries. They really began, were a function of distance. That people began to build relationships based on distance. But as the distance furthered from those points, from those key cultural interfaces, that the cultures themselves became distinct. And this is a very important part. That physical geography clearly has a determinant, but the cultural geography, the human geography, is also a very strong pull. And we're going to explore that next.